the International Soccer Preview. We are Soccer Files Canada. Welcome to Series 20, looking at the groups and teams of the 2023 African Cup, played in Ivory Coast in January 2024. This episode is looking at Group B, Egypt, Ghana, Cape Verde, and Mozambique. Here we go. It's the International Soccer Preview by Soccer Files Canada, Series 20. I'm Kevin.
And I'm Connor. And today we are looking at Group B for the African Cup 2023 tournament. This group includes Egypt, Ghana, Cape Verde, and Mozambique.
Yeah, and we usually give some information about our past, present, and future media casts at this point. But if you want that, we'll direct you to the video on our YouTube homepage, which covers that information in a video, and the address is on the screen. And for listeners, it's youtube.com/@soccerfiles, and that can be found in the show notes.
Yeah, for now, we'll just say that we're currently focused on the 2023 Asian and African Cups. Both are being played in January 2024. And we're producing this group and team series as well as a player series for each.
Right. So meanwhile, let's get on with the show.
Yeah, so this series previews the groups and teams for African Cup 2023, which kind of confusingly takes place in January 2024. And we're changing our usual format here because we did a full series for the 2021 African Cup, which was played in January 2022.
Yeah, so there we did the usual overviews of World and African Cups, as well as look at their local cup history. And that series featured a deep dive into the team's history in the African Cup finals. And it also examined the recent history of the teams, of course.
Yeah, so we think it's a bit too much to repeat that information every 2 years. So in this series, we're only going to do that for teams that were not involved in the 2021 African Cup. And for those that were, we'll provide links and even times in the show notes so it can be easily reviewed.
Right. So in this series, for teams that were covered in the 2021 African Cup, we're going to give a summary of their history as well as their recent history. And the only team among these four that weren't involved was Mozambique.
That's right. But yeah, we'll look at the three sections of this mediacast in outline.
Okay, in part one, we'll introduce the teams in the group, giving the location and the population of each country.
In part two, we'll do an overview of each team's history and recent form. So as we said, in the case of teams that did appear in the previous African Cup, this will be a summary with links in the show notes to the full version history done in 2021. And in the case of the teams not covered in the previous tournament, so that's Mozambique here, we'll give an overview of world, regional, and local history with a deep dive into their history in the African Cup finals.
Right, and then part three, as usual, will be a comparison of the teams in terms of their ranking, head-to-head record, and odds. Well, we got to talk about that. And we're going to end with a discussion of their prospects and our predictions.
All right, are you ready to jump into it?
Nope, I'm going to zing you with a question on your first impressions. What are your first impressions of this group?
First impressions, you probably have two strong teams, one medium team, and Mozambique. Probably just happy to be here, maybe a little making up the numbers. And I think you have in Ghana, especially a team that could, do well or could suffer as they did in 2021. I think they have a statement to prove. So, yeah, early thoughts, but I guess we'll talk more about it later.
Okay, so I see that you're not bold enough to pick a group winner there.
If you're forcing me, I would say Egypt, but maybe I'll be swayed.
Okay, let's see if the information sways us on that one. And we're going to start with part one, an overview of the teams and the countries.
Yeah, so we'll start with Egypt. Their nickname is the Pharaohs. Egypt has a population of 112 million, which is actually the third largest in Africa. And Egypt is kind of a medium-large country in Northeast Africa. It borders Libya and Sudan, the Mediterranean Sea, and then also Israel and the Red Sea to the east.
Right. Okay. And team number 2, Ghana.
Ghana, their nickname is the Black Stars. Ghana has a population of 34.1 million people, and it's a medium small country in West Central Africa, and it's actually neighbors with tournament host Ivory Coast.
All right. Team number 3, Cape Verde.
Cape Verde, their nickname is the Blue Sharks.
I like that.
Their population is yeah, it's a great name for an island country. Their population is 600,000. That's the third smallest in all of Africa, and they're the smallest country competing in the African Cup. And Cape Verde is a small island chain west of Africa, off the coast of Senegal and Mauritania.
All right. And then our last country is Mozambique.
Yeah, Mozambique, their nickname is the Mambas. Mozambique has a population of 33.9 million people, and it's a medium-large country in southwest Africa. It's kind of stretched out on the Indian Ocean and is across from Madagascar.
All right. Mozambique, new to the Cup. So let's just summarize what you've said there in terms of a comparison of their populations.
Yeah, so the largest is Egypt, again, one of the largest in Africa at 112 million. Interestingly, Ghana and Mozambique are virtually identical in population. The numbers I have are 34.1 million for Ghana and 33.9 million for Mozambique. So you could basically round them both to 34, but we'll give Ghana the edge. And then you have Cape Verde, a tiny country, just 600,000. So one large, 2 medium, and 1 very small.
All right, and I'm going to make the flag sizes on the graphic represent that.
All right, well,
just like that.
Yeah, that's just about right.
Okay, let us move on then to part 2, and we begin with Egypt, and we're just going to do a summary of Egypt. Again, if you want the kind of the full length, we'll put a link for that in the show notes for what we did for the 2021 African Cup a couple of years ago.
All right. So in summary, Egypt is overall a second-tier team in World Cup play and a top-tier team in African Cup competition. They've reached the World Cup 3 times, but have never gone beyond the group stage. Their African Cup record shows great strength with 7 title wins. 2 of these came in the first 2 cups, and the last were 3 in a row from 2006 to 2010, although they never reached the World Cup during that strong period. They have had lulls in their African Cup record, but they never last more than 3 tournaments. The last of these came from 2012 to 2015, failing to qualify for 3 cups in a row directly after their hat trick of title wins. That's really amazing.
Yeah.
And in terms of cup wins, Egypt are the strongest African team by that measure.
Yes. I maybe mention the Arab Cup there, and we'll move on to their recent performances.
Yeah, so in terms of the Arab Cup, Egypt also won the Arab Cup in 1992. That victory came in the middle of their 2 isolated African Cup titles, so a strong period for them there.
Right, so we won't talk too much about that on and off again competition, but we will move on to their recent cup history. We're going to skip the deep dive for this one and start with the African Cup in 2021. Well, maybe, Connor, I'll just summarize kind of their recent history in the lead up to this African Cup.
Yeah.
So as we saw, they came out of missing their 3rd African Cup in a row in 2015 with a 2nd place finish in the 2017 edition. And they went on in 2018 to reach the first World Cup they reached since 1990. And they went into that cup with high hopes, but they disappointed, losing all games there. And they also had high expectations going into the 2019 African Cup, which they hosted, but disappointed again, knocked out in the round of 16 there. So let's see how they fared since in the recent history here.
Yeah, so we'll begin with the 2021 African Cup. So Egypt qualified fairly comfortably, but not without a few hiccups. They topped their group, which included Comoros, Kenya, and Togo. But they did win 3 and tied 3. So perhaps not as dominant as they might have expected in what was a fairly weak group. In fact, Comoros finishing second there. And then at the tournament itself, Egypt began with a 1-0 loss to Nigeria, but followed that up with 2 1-0 victories over Guinea-Bissau and Sudan, which saw them go through in second place. In the round of 16, and basically onwards, they tied all their games, but they won 5-4 in penalties over Ivory Coast, beat Morocco in extra time in the quarterfinals, and then beat host Cameroon in penalties in the semifinals. In the final, they went to penalties yet again, and this time they were defeated, losing 4-2 in the shootout to Senegal.
Yeah, so a less convincing campaign, I would say, than the result.
Yeah, when you look at it, they actually only scored 3 goals, 4 if you include extra time, and that took them all the way to the final. So they got there really on a very good defensive record, only conceding twice. Yeah, probably, going to penalties, it kind of leaves a bit more to luck, and it kind of ran out right at the end.
Yeah, absolutely. And then tying Kenya twice and Comoros once in the group stage, although, as you say, they did kind of comfortably finish first there, or in qualifying, I should say.
Yeah.
Okay, well, the next tournament we'll look at is actually the Arab Cup in 2021. And this, as I said, was an on and off again tournament. But in 2021, it became kind of a more significant tournament because it was backed by FIFA. So it looks like going forward, it's going to be a bigger event.
Yeah, a lot of teams took this tournament very seriously. Egypt entered in the group stage. Some teams did have to qualify. And there they beat Lebanon and Sudan before tying Algeria, but they still finished top of the group. Actually, I'm not sure how Egypt taking first place on fair play points, given their identical record.
Yeah, 7 goals for and 1 against for both teams.
Amazing. That first place finish set them up in a match against Jordan. You may not be surprised to hear that Egypt tied and went to extra time. They then lost to Tunisia, the North African rivals, in the semifinal before losing the third place match, once again in penalties, 5-4 to Qatar after a 0-0 draw.
Yeah, and they lost Tunisia in the semifinal on an own goal at 90+5 there.
Ouch, that's a tough way to lose a game.
Yeah. Okay, next tournament to look at is their qualification for the World Cup in 2022.
Yeah. Egypt were solid at home, as they often are, beating Angola, Libya, and Gabon. But they tied on the road twice in Gabon and Angola. They also beat neighbors Libya. So again, a couple more points dropped, as we saw in 2021 African Cup qualifying. But nonetheless, they finished first place comfortably. Winning the group sent them to a home and away playoff against Senegal, whom they met in the African Cup final just a couple months before. Both teams won the home game 1-0, and it was penalties yet again for Egypt, and they were defeated 3-1. So losing in penalties to Senegal meant they missed out on the World Cup by the narrowest of margins.
Yes, that's got to hurt. Two in a row losses to Senegal on penalties. Wow. Let's finish with seeing how they qualified for this cup.
Yeah, Egypt won 5 of their 6 games. The only blemish on their record was a loss 2-0 away in Ethiopia, who finished bottom of the group. Ethiopia, that was their only win. But Egypt taking 6 points off both Malawi and Guinea.
Right, so a pretty convincing qualification for this cup. And there we go. So that brings us to our second team, Ghana. We're going to start that with a summary, actually, because we did Ghana 2 years ago. So we'll just go with the summary here.
Yeah, so Ghana is a top-tier team in Africa with periodic second or even third-tier performances. Their World Cup record was long overdue in catching up with their African Cup record when they finally reached the World Cup for the first time only in 2006. They passed the group stage both then and in 2010 when they reached the high of a quarterfinal finish. Though they have dropped off since, they have reached 4 of the last 5 World Cups. Meanwhile, their success in the African Cup goes much further. They won 4 titles over 10 editions between 1963 and 1982. There was a weak period in there after that, but from 1992, they've not only been consistent in reaching the Cup, but in passing the group stage with a particularly good period between 2008 and 2017. That period saw them win their 2 titles in their local Wafu Cup, and that is more than any other country in the locality, and they finished in the top 4 in all 5 editions they've entered. But in the African Cup, they haven't won any other titles since those first 4.
Right, okay. And before we move on to the recent history, and we're going to just kind of bring you up to date for that. So their group stage passing strength in the World Cup dropped off after reaching the quarterfinals in 2010, but they remained very strong in the African Cup and in their local cup until 2017. However, they didn't reach the World Cup in 2018, and that was their only failure since 2006. And they didn't finish in the top 4 in African Cup for the first time since 2016. Oh, sorry, since 2006. A round of 16 finish in the 2019 African Cup was a bit of a disappointing drop also. So let's see if this decline continues into their recent history. And actually that recent history, because there's no more recent local cup than the 2019 Wafu Nations Cup, we're going to begin there just so we can kind of get a taste of that cup.
Yeah, so this tournament features a sorting round, a one-off game, which determines whether you go into the trophy or the, I guess, less prestigious plate path. Ghana won their sorting round match against Gambia. Then after that, it's just a straight knockout. They beat Burkina Faso in penalties, then Ivory Coast before losing to Senegal in the final. So second place in the most recent Wafu Nations Cup.
Right, and tasting the flavor of losing to Senegal 3-1 on penalties, just like Egypt.
That's right.
All right. Well, the next one is the African Cup in 2021.
Yeah, so in terms of qualifying, Ghana were in a close race with South Africa. Ghana won all 3 games at home. They also beat Sao Tome and Principe on the road, but they lost to Sudan and tied South Africa 1-1. It actually meant Ghana, Sudan, and South Africa finished just 3 points between them. Ghana finished first with 13 points, Sudan with 12, and South Africa with 10. So South Africa missed out there.
Yeah, Ghana and South Africa have a bit of a rivalry, both because of this and another campaign. Anyway, they did make it to the group stage. So how did they do there?
In the group stage, Ghana started with a loss to Morocco, which is understandable, losing that game 1-0. They then tied Gabon 1-1. And then in their final match against Minos Comoros, they lost 3-2. So Ghana crashed out of the group stage. The other 3 teams advanced, but Ghana's single point saw them in last place. So a shocking result for them there.
Yeah, really shocking. First time they've been knocked out of the African Cup group stage.
Wow.
In a long, long time. Meanwhile, the World Cup in 2022, the qualifying was taking place. How did they do?
They were once again placed with South Africa, only one team going through. Ghana was again perfect at home, but had a similar 1-1-1 record on the road, losing to South Africa, beating Zimbabwe, and then tying Ethiopia. That put Ghana and South Africa in a lock at 13 points at the top of the table with only one team going through, and they had an identical goal difference, but Ghana edged it out on goals scored. There's a bit of controversy in that group. Maybe you want to talk about that?
Yeah, South Africa was very upset about the game. They actually appealed the loss based on the refereeing of the Senegalese officials. So beyond a very soft penalty decision on which the only goal of the game came, they claimed that all of the calls went against them and went as far as to calling it match fixing. I don't know if you saw any of that.
I do see highlights. The penalty was a little bit soft. I can't kind of speak to all the match fixing, but yeah, that all came about in the final game, which Ghana won, and that's what secured them advancement to the final stage of World Cup qualifying. So it was hugely significant.
Yeah.
But match was not replayed in the end.
Right. South Africa, always a bit kind of, well, I wouldn't quite say unlucky in tournaments, but kind of the final result always seems to go against them. So they've been a bit, had a bit of a tough go of it. Yeah.
All right. Well, it put Ghana into a playoff, a home and away playoff with Nigeria, another of their great rivals. They tied 0-0 in Ghana and tied 1-1 in Nigeria, but Ghana advanced to the World Cup on the away goals rule. So a tight qualification, but there they were.
Yeah, very much so. And Nigeria was kind of heavily favoured because this was shortly after Ghana got knocked out of the 2021 Cup at the group stage, African Cup. So Nigeria is expected to win. Nevertheless, Ghana gets to the World Cup. And how did they do there?
Yeah, they were quite an entertaining team. They lost to 3-2 to Portugal in their first match before beating South Korea by the same score, 3-2. In the last match, they lost 2-0 to Uruguay. But despite the loss, Ghana fought valiantly to prevent Uruguay from getting the extra goal they needed that would have qualified them for the knockout round. Exacting a measure of revenge for the infamous Suarez handball in 2010.
Yeah, well put. Uruguay was doing everything they could to score a goal at the end there, but I think Ghana was all too happy to stand in their way.
Yeah, it was funny to see a team down 2-0 and heading out of the World Cup fight so hard to to not give up the other goal. It was entertaining, and then South Korea scored a dramatic late winner against Portugal too. So
yeah, so actually neither of them passed in the end, but I think Ghana came out of that game a lot happier.
Yeah.
All right, that's the 2022 World Cup and the local cup. Now, there was supposed to be an edition of the cup in 2021. 2021, the WAFU Nations Cup, West African teams. That was scheduled to be played, but not played. And that tournament is a bit up in the air. We've noted before that the local tournaments don't seem to be as strong in Africa as they are in Asia.
Yeah.
So we move on then to the qualifying for this tournament, the African Cup 2023.
Yeah, Ghana once again showed strong home form, but kind of indifferent away form. They won all three at home against Madagascar, Central African Republic, and Angola, but tied all three of those away games, some which Ghana probably should have been winning. But nevertheless, they topped the group with 12 points to qualify for this tournament.
Yeah, I mean, probably you're right. They should have gotten a bit more on the road, but I think in Africa, where road games are tough, that's kind of a formula for winning. If you win your home games and tie your away games, you're pretty much good to go.
No, that's a great point.
All right, well, that is the end of Ghana, and so we move on to our look at team number 3, Cape Verde.
Yeah, so in summary, Cape Verde was a third-tier team, but recently have made an argument as a second-tier team due to near consistent qualification for the African Cup. In World Cup play, they've moved from preliminary round exits or finishes near the bottom of the table to more competitive finishes since 2010, finishing in the top half of the semi-final round table in 3 of the last 4 campaigns. Having never reached the African Cup until 2013, they did so twice from 2012 to 2017, and came very close in the other 2 editions. They've even passed the group stage in 2 of their 3 successful qualifications, a quarter-final finish in 2013, their best result. They've only joined the last 2 editions of the local WAFU Cup, which Ghana is also a member of, but turned in a competitive performance in 2019.
Yeah, that's right. So before we look up to so we won't do the deep dive again. We did Cape Verde in the last African Cup 2 years ago, and I'll just do a bit of a build up to their recent history. 2010 saw them move from a third to a second tier team, as Connor said, with better results in both World Cup and African Cup play. It's not without its lapses, though. The 2018 World Cup qualifying saw them only edge past Kenya in an early round and then finish in the bottom half of the table, the only instance of that in recent times. In fairness, though, that was a tough group. However, there's no excuse for their ghastly African Cup campaign in 2019, where they finished behind both Tanzania and Lesotho and failing to reach the newly expanded cup. So let's take a look and see if they kind of recovered their fairly new second-tier form in their local or in their recent tournaments. And once again, we start with the WAFU Cup in 2019 because that is the most recent edition.
Yeah, so we talked about this with Ghana. The tournament starts with the sorting round, which Cape Verde lost to Ivory Coast. But in the plate, kind of the plate bracket of the tournament, they beat Nigeria on penalties in the quarterfinals, then Gambia in the semifinals before losing to Guinea on penalties in the final. But overall a pretty good performance from them.
Yeah, pretty good. All right, well, the next one is the African Cup in 2021. So they did reach the tournament this time. How did they do?
Yeah, they started with 4 draws. Those were home and away matches. They tied Cameroon, Mozambique, and Rwanda twice. So it left them in a bit of a perilous position, but they won their last 2 games, a 3-1 home win over Cameroon and a 1-0 away win over Mozambique, who they meet here. So those wins helped them finish second in the table and qualify for the tournament.
Right, good finish there with the home win over Cameroon. So they did make it to the group stage. And how did they do there?
Yeah, they won their first game over Ethiopia, then lost to Burkina Faso, but managed to get a draw against tournament host Cameroon to finish with 4 points. That was tied for second and third place in the group, but they went through as one of the best third place finishers onto the round of 16.
Good for them.
And once there, they lost to Senegal 2-0, who were the eventual tournament winner. So a tough draw, but they did get out of the group stage.
Right. Well, when you pass through in third place, you're going to be playing one of the group winners from another group. So a bit of a tough draw, but that's the result of finishing third. Anyway, once again, passing the group stage in a tournament, that kind of makes them an interesting team in the competition we're looking at here.
Yeah, and taking points off Cameroon, not just in qualifying, but in the tournament, shows that they can be competitive with some good teams as well.
Yeah, definitely. We will talk to that in the discussion because I had noticed that too. Well, we saw that the local cup, the WAFU Nations Cup, was cancelled in 2021 or was scheduled but not played. And so we look at the World Cup in 2022 and their qualification run.
Yeah, so Cape Verde were in a group with Nigeria, Liberia, and Central African Republic. They started with a draw in Central African Republic and a loss at home to Nigeria before winning 3 in a row and setting up a do-or-die game against Nigeria in their final match. They were on the road and they did need to win that game to overcome Nigeria. They only managed a tie, which is credible in itself, but they were close to overcoming Nigeria right at the death. Nigeria finishing with 13 points and advancing, and Cape Verde finishing with 11 points, so not advancing to the final round.
Yeah, but a very respectable performance there. Okay, and finally we look at the qualification for this cup. We know they made it, but how did they get here?
Yeah, it came with kind of their characteristic mix of wins, draws, and losses. They beat Togo and Burkina Faso at home and Eswatini on the road, and then otherwise tied Eswatini at home, kind of a disappointing result, and then losing to Burkina Faso and Togo. It meant a fairly competitive group, but in the end, they finished just a point behind group winners Burkina Faso and qualified in second place.
All right, and here they are in their 4th African Cup. And that brings us to the end of Cape Verde. So we move on to Mozambique. And in this case, we don't do just a summary, but the full meal deal here, Connor. Beginning with a look at the participation and achievements.
So Mozambique entered their first World Cup in 1982, but had problems after that, not entering in 1986 and having their entry rejected in 1990. They participated consistently, though, from 1994. Their first African Cup was in 1982, but there was no problem there, and they participated without fail from that time. Their local group is COSAFA, which is the Council of Southern African Football Association. That was formed in 1997 and consists of 14 nations.
Yeah, they play pretty much every year in COSAFA, so a lot of tournaments since 1997, and we will take a look at that later on. In terms of strength, Mozambique is a third-tier team. They generally pass or receive byes in preliminary rounds of World Cup qualifying, and they consistently finish 3rd of 4 in the semi-final round. They've never reached the World Cup and have only reached the final round of qualification once, and that was in 2010. They have reached the African Cup 4 times, most recently in 2010, so that was a peak year for them, but they have never passed the group stage. Okay, let's go on to a slightly closer look at the World Cup. Still an overview.
From Mozambique's start in 1982 up until 2006, they were knocked out in the preliminary round. Over the 12 games to that, they managed only 1 win and had to wait until 2002 to achieve it. The 2010 format was a bit different, offering a group stage in the first round, and they finished 2nd of 4 there to make it to the final round, where they went undefeated at home. They have since passed preliminary rounds, but been only mildly competitive in the rounds following.
That's right. So now for an overview of their African Cup history before we do a deep dive into their finals history. So generally they've done better in African Cup play than in World Cup play. From the beginning, they've passed preliminary rounds and have been more competitive in further rounds, be it another knockout round or a group stage format. That competitiveness led them to the African Cup finals in 1986 and then twice in a row in 1996 and 1998. And we saw that strength did not register in World Cup play, but the good World Cup performance that we saw in 2010 does mirror in their only other successful African Cup qualification, also there in 2010. They also came close to qualifying 3 times recently in 2008, 2013, and in the expanded edition in 2019. But before we look at their recent history, we will take a look at the African Cup finals in detail.
Sure. So Mozambique's first entry into the African Cup in 1986 saw them in a very tough group. Though Ivory Coast and Senegal were not as big in stature as they are now, they were clearly beyond Mozambique's level, and group winners Egypt even more so. Mozambique lost all 3 games and failed to score a goal. Those 7 goals against meant the scorelines were mostly respectable.
Yeah, we move on then to 1996, and that saw them in the first of 2 tournaments in a row. And they started 1996 well with a draw against Tunisia. However, competitive losses with Ivory Coast and Ghana, that was 1-0 and 2-0 respectively, meant a better defensive performance, but still a last place finish. But that was more than they would earn in 1998, where they lost to Egypt, Morocco, and Zambia, giving up 8 goals in that tournament.
2010 saw them again start with a draw against Benin, the only team they could reasonably expect to get points from, but they lost to Egypt and Nigeria, another strong group, and again finished last, this time on goal difference.
Right, and then they haven't qualified since then, so the final round's kind of proving a bit too much for Mozambique, which, we'll talk about whether that'll be the case here a bit later. And before we move on to the recent thing, we're going to go and talk about the local cup, the COSAFA Cup. That's actually one of the more, how would I say it, participated in, I'm looking for a word, Connor, one of the more participated in cups in Africa, one of the local cups that's taken most seriously.
That's right. Yeah, it's got a better kind of competitive history than some others.
That works. Okay, yeah. Do you want to take us through that or me?
Sure, you can go for it. You're familiar with it.
Okay, the local group then is the COSAFA Cup. That is the Council of Southern African Football Associations. So think in terms of Southern Africa. The cup began in 1997 when South Africa was reintroduced into FIFA. And it takes place almost every year, but it was cancelled from 2010 to 2012 and then again in 2020. So Mozambique have challenged among the 14 teams here for a finish in the top 4, but only twice have they finished in second place. The other stronger teams in the region are South Africa, although not as strong as one might guess in this cup, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Angola, and Namibia. The top teams in the locality. So 2 fourth-place finishes in 2021 and 2022 improved on their record of 3 group stage exits in a row prior to that. All right, so now I think we're ready to move on to the recent tournaments, and we begin with the African Cup in 2021.
Yeah, so Mozambique started well with a home win over third-place finishers Rwanda and a draw in Cape Verde, who finished second, but then they lost all their games after that, including their next 2 with first-place Cameroon, and they ultimately finished last in the qualifying group.
All right, well, we do see here that they have taken points off Cape Verde, which we'll see in the head-to-head as well. The next tournament was the local cup in 2021, but we're only going to do the most recent edition of that one. They finished 4th place in that cup, as we saw. And next tournament after that was the World Cup 2022 campaign.
Yeah, so they were among the bottom 28 teams, which required them to play a round 1 of 3 preliminary knockout round. There they beat Mauritius, winning both matches and going through 3-0 on aggregate. And they were kind of expected to win that matchup. In the main round, they tied Ivory Coast at home in their opener, but then lost 4 straight, including twice to Cameroon and also to Malawi. They did beat Malawi at home in their final match, though, and that was enough to move them off the bottom and into 3rd place, but well behind top 2 finishers, Cameroon and Ivory Coast.
Yeah, that's right. And we've seen that third place is kind of their standard finish in World Cup campaigns. The next one was again a local cup. We saw it's being played every year, and they finished fourth place again in this one. But we'll only look closely at the most recent one in 2023, and that actually is what we'll describe in a bit more detail now.
Yeah, so they were in a group of four. It started with a draw against Angola, followed by a loss against Lesotho, and then a victory over Mauritius, who they had met in that 2022 World Cup playoff round. So in the end, it was 4 points with a win, a draw, and a loss, but that was two behind group winners Lesotho, and only Lesotho advanced beyond it. So yeah, not beyond the group stage this time.
Yeah, an uncharacteristically strong performance by Lesotho there. And the last thing we'll look at is the African Cup qualifying campaign for this tournament.
That's right. So Mozambique started with the draw at home to Rwanda, then beat Benin 1-0 on the road for an impressive result. They did drop two in a row to Senegal, but then beat Rwanda and Benin again. So they finished with 10 points, ahead of 5 ahead of Benin, who were the pot 2 team, and just 4 behind Senegal. So a very impressive second place finish with 3 wins, a draw, and 2 losses.
Yeah, 2 wins over Benin, and a pretty consistent showing there. And we'll talk a bit later about whether that good performance gives them a better chance in this cup. But that's it for the history section. And so we're going to move on to part 3, where we basically compare the teams before we reach some conclusions about their relative strength. And we start with the pots that they came from.
Yeah, we look at pots just to kind of compare the relative strength or how tough or weak a draw may have been. So Egypt are the pot 1 team. Kind of taking away Ivory Coast, who are given kind of the 1A spot. Egypt were actually the lowest ranked team in pot 1. And Ghana were the second lowest ranked team in pot 2. So I guess if you're one of the smaller teams, you think maybe you avoided some tougher competition there. Pot 3 team Cape Verde were second in that pot, and Mozambique were also second in pot 4. So on the face of it, a little bit more parity than some other groups might have.
Yeah, not sure. I really agree that Egypt and Ghana are as weak as the pots make them seem. But it is interesting, especially Cape Verde coming from high in pot 3, and actually Mozambique respectably high in pot 4 too. So makes it an interesting group.
Yeah.
Let's take a look at the rankings for each team, the FIFA and the ELO rankings.
Yeah, so Egypt are currently 35th in FIFA and 48th in ELO. That's actually a bit of a rise from where they were kind of 4 or 5 years ago, when they were kind of in the high 50s in both rankings. And that's partly due to their run to the African Cup final recently, though it wasn't as high as they were kind of leading into the 2018 World Cup, which they qualified for, when they were 24th in FIFA and 38th in ELO.
Yeah, I don't really have anything to add there. I think, the history that we talked about in part 2 kind of covers it well. And it is clear that they've taken a rise with that World Cup, African Cup final appearance.
Yeah, overall a bit up and down, though.
Yeah, definitely. From 2015, when they started qualifying for the Cup again, they've moved up from then.
Yeah.
Okay, how about Ghana?
Yeah, so Ghana are 60th in FIFA and 63rd in ELO. Both of those are low points for Ghana, arguably too low, one could say, but we did see a very poor African Cup 2021 performance. Though they did reach the last World Cup. A decade ago, Ghana were 21st in FIFA, so it's dropping down to 60th is quite a fall from that. And it's
Yeah.
kind of been a slow and steady fall since then.
Yeah, I mean, they did kind of fall from 2013, but they remained strong, at least in African Cup, until 2017. So I'm not really sure what it means that they were down to 50th by 2017, but definitely over the past few years they've gotten weak, and that African Cup knockout in the group stage probably did them some harm.
Yeah. Next is Cape Verde, the POP3 team. They're 71st in FIFA and a little bit lower, 81st in ELO. It's pretty consistent where they've been the last few years. As we saw, they've been kind of consistent in qualifying for tournaments, but not kind of really threatening at the World Cup level. So 71st and 81st for Cape Verde.
Ghana is 25 points behind Egypt in the FIFA rankings and just 11 points ahead of Cape Verde. The ELO rankings kind of has them more in the middle of those two, so might be a good place to begin the discussion as to where we're seeing Ghana.
Yeah.
All right, and yes, go ahead.
No, finally we have Mozambique. They're 113th in FIFA and 119th in ELO. Mozambique are seldom above 100 in either ranking systems, but this recent qualification will boost them a little bit, and has recently, but kind of just below 100 is where they often find themselves.
Yeah, and I mean, really, they did reach this cup, but it was kind of no great feat. They almost reached it in 2019 with the expansion of the cup, and Mozambique is a team that's going to be close to reaching the expanded 24-team cup. So a slightly better performance kind of got them here, but I really haven't seen any kind of breakthrough performances.
Yeah, that's a good point.
All right. Well, now we move on to the head-to-head result, and maybe if you read them out, I'll point out any really relevant stuff.
Yeah, so Egypt and Ghana, two teams with great history in this tournament. Egypt has a winning record in competitive matches with 4 wins, 2 draws, and 2 losses.
Yeah, they met quite a bit between 2010 and 2018. Actually, 2010 African Cup final, Egypt won that. And then in the 2014 World Cup qualifying, Egypt lost 6-1 in Ghana. A bit of a shocking result there.
Wow.
In 2018 World Cup qualifying, that was the last time they met, and Egypt got the better of it with a win and a draw. So, yeah, that kind of matches the overall record of Egypt having the advantage.
All right, next we have Egypt versus Cape Verde, and they have no history together, so this will be their first competitive meeting.
That's right. So we better move on to the next one, Egypt.
Yeah, Egypt and Mozambique. They've met 5 times, but Egypt has won all 5 of those matchups.
Yeah, that's right. And the most recent was in 2014 World Cup qualifying, where Egypt won both legs. Every time they've met in the group stage of an African Cup, it's been 2-0 Egypt. Just a little detail there.
Yeah, meeting 3 times in that tournament.
Yeah.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Next, we move on to Ghana and Cape Verde, the pot 2 and 3 teams. But actually, Ghana has dominated in their matchups head-to-head, winning all 3 of the times they've met each other.
That's right. The most recent one was in the 2013 African Cup, actually in the quarterfinal there. Cape Verde have never scored a goal against Ghana.
Interesting. Ghana and Mozambique have met 4 times. Ghana has 3 wins, but Mozambique does have a draw in there.
Yes, and that was in the most recent meeting in the 2017 African Cup qualifying. So, kind of maybe significant that Mozambique can take points, and that was, when Ghana was still doing quite well. So, we'll see if we think it reflects on their chances here.
Yeah, and then finally, Cape Verde versus Mozambique. Cape Verde has a winning record, but it's close. 2 wins, a draw, and a loss.
Right, and both of those meetings are fairly recent. 2015 African Cup qualifying, where they exchanged home wins, and then in 2021. So we saw that in the recent history, where Mozambique managed to tie at home against Cape Verde.
All right.
Yeah. Okay. So we do see that Mozambique can take points off a couple of these teams. Just before we get into our discussion, I'll point out that we were looking for odds. We always like to see what the gamblers are thinking about the game, but it's kind of too far before the cup to find odds on the group. I would like to see what they think, though. Perhaps we can do that if we do an update podcast shortly before the cup.
Yeah, that's right.
All right. Well, let's move on to the discussion. And I'm going to start where I mentioned whether you believe those rankings that we saw, whether you think Ghana is closer to Egypt or closer to Cape Verde.
Ultimately, I think probably in the middle, which is how Elo has it, is right. I don't necessarily see Egypt and Ghana in particular, being so far ahead of Cape Verde. I think Cape Verde are competitive and can take points off top teams, and Ghana's prone to lapses. I mean, they did restore, I think, a bit of their reputation and strength by qualifying for the most recent World Cup, especially over the more favored Nigeria. But I see Ghana somewhere in between Egypt and Cape Verde.
Yeah. I have a bit of a shine on Ghana because of the they brought some new players into the World Cup. I'm thinking Tariq Lamptey. I'm not sure if you know any others, but kind of surprised by bringing a few new players in, and I kind of have the feeling that rejuvenated them a bit. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I believe Chris Hughton, who's maybe well known to Premier League fans, he's now in a role with Ghana and has helped bring in perhaps some British players or players playing in Britain with Ghana connections. So I think it's a good thing for them, and if they can get kind of a young crop to build around, it would be promising for the future. They do have some good players already at their disposal, and perhaps more they can draw on.
Yeah, I mean, I can even see some of those imports from England kind of inspiring the good players that they have, and a bit of competition for spots never hurts. So I really kind of felt they were a bit more fresh and lively in the 2022 World Cup. I mean, especially compared to the dull performance in the 2021 African Cup.
Yeah, they were competitive in each of their 3 games there for sure.
Do you think, though, it's strong enough for them to overcome Egypt here?
Egypt are very good in this tournament, and they proved themselves a tough team to beat. At their best, sure. I mean, I think Egypt, I don't think Egypt are so far ahead of Ghana or the other teams that they're untouchable. But I do think Egypt are the strongest team and kind of have the recent pedigree to prove it, despite not making the African Cup or the most recent World Cup. But that came down to a penalty shootout, so they were still very, very close.
Yeah, and they've always done better in African Cup than in World Cup. Cape Verde, as you said, is a capable team. I'm not making a pun there. Do you think they could actually dictate affairs at the top?
Definitely, I'm actually quite big on Cape Verde. I like the way they've played. I like what they've achieved. Kind of for in terms of population, they're a minnow. They're a tiny country. Less than 1 million people to the millions in Ghana and especially in Egypt. So they're kind of a persistent underdog, and I kind of find myself rooting for them because of that. And I think they can kind of take points off a lot of teams. I enjoyed them in the last African Cup, and definitely, I think they're good enough to trouble Egypt and Ghana, certainly at the game level, and possibly upsetting one of them enough to have a dramatic impact on this group.
Yeah, I mean, you did say at some point earlier that both Egypt and Ghana are capable of lapses. And, if that lapse comes in the form of dropping points to Cape Verde, it could be quite damaging, because I think both Egypt and Ghana will have eyes, I would say, at least on the top four. And I think finishing first or second in the group could have a big effect on those ambitions. What do you think?
Yeah, I think so. If you win the group, you're can get a much more favorable round of 16 draw, and sometimes even a quarterfinal draw because of that. Whereas second place, you kind of face tougher teams earlier on. So, both Egypt and Ghana, if they want to go deep in this tournament, will definitely have eyes on top spot, because it can lead to an easier passage, later on. And I think that's important for any team that wants to go far in the tournament.
Yeah. I think Cape Verde is likely to take points off Mozambique, who we'll get to in a second. I think a tie against Egypt or Ghana could see them through in third place, even though that might mean facing a tough team like Senegal, as they did before. Do you see third place? I think you were going to say yes, that third place is quite possible for them.
Yeah, I think it is. And I think third place, I think they would have enough in terms of points or even goal difference possibly to go through as a third place finisher. So yeah, it means a difficult round, but or a difficult matchup in the next round. But they have proven themselves strong enough to get out of groups at the African Cup. So they're not just a small team making up numbers. I think they have a good chance of getting out of this group.
I mean, anything can happen in the African Cup. We saw Ghana losing to Comoros. I think they'll be stronger this time. But, results like that make me feel like Cape Verde, possibly even Mozambique, because we've seen Madagascar do well. Teams like Comoros, some small teams come into the Cup and they're very motivated. So odd things can happen. So that might help out Cape Verde. But really, I'm asking it to see if you give Mozambique any chance.
I don't really. I think making it is good for them. They're kind of a team that may be on the cusp, as you said, in an expanded tournament. They haven't got a win yet. This will be their fourth or fifth, actually, appearance. I think fifth. Yeah, I think this is a difficult group for them. Egypt and Ghana are strong teams, and Cape Verde is a very strong team from pot 3. So I think this was a tough draw for them. I think they'll struggle to get points out of this group.
Yeah, I got to say I agree with you there. As I said in the or earlier in the podcast, Mozambique. What did I say? I said Mozambique haven't really upped their game in terms of their standard. They just kind of had a bit of an easier group, which allowed them to get to the Cup here. So I think it's going to be a similar performance as to the other African Cups they've been in, where they were always a bit out of their depth. But there is always a chance of a marvelous performance, and the African Cup is great for spitting those out, but they're not to be predicted, right?
That's right. I did want to ask you about the top two in the group. I've kind of said Ghana. I see them kind of in between Egypt and Cape Verde. Do you see Ghana as a real threat to take top spot in this group?
I'm going to shock you by saying I think Ghana will take top spot in the group. We saw kind of how narrowly Egypt won all their games in the 2021 African Cup, even though they did reach the final. And even if that means kind of getting off to a slow start here, I think it can be more devastating in this group stage, with Cape Verde kind of ready to pounce. Not that I think Egypt will think or will finish third, but I just feel that Ghana is going to be a bit more consistent here. So I'm picking them to top the group, Connor.
Wow. Well, that would be a dramatic turnaround from their fourth place finish at the last African Cup. On the other hand, perhaps lightning is not going to strike twice, and perhaps Ghana is going to come into this group with a bit more preparedness and determination to avoid the disaster that struck them last time.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely don't think something like that will happen again. I'm not fully convinced that they will finish ahead of Egypt, but I think it's a very tight battle at the top, maybe tighter than the rankings suggest. And as I said, I'm going out on a bit of a limb picking them as winners. How about you? You said at the beginning you think Egypt and then Ghana, and you still seem to be leaning that way.
I think I am. I think Ghana are probably the most unpredictable team. I think Egypt will be consistent. I think Mozambique are in tough, and I think Cape Verde will be a strong pot 3 team. But Ghana, I'm kind of not sure. They could do really well and finish first. They could, be beaten again, as they were last tournament. So Ghana, I probably have the most difficulty placing overall.
All right, and let's finish with this in terms of their overall success in the Cup. I think I said earlier, Egypt and Ghana are probably both eyeing at least the top 4. Do you think that's a realistic expectation?
I think probably a bit more for Egypt than Ghana, just because for Ghana it would be more of a turnaround. But they can certainly go on a run, and they're playing. They won't have home field advantage, but they're playing in neighboring Ivory Coast, so it'll be more similar for them than perhaps some others, and they'll have good backing. With Egypt, they're not always the most exciting team. In fact, they can be dull, but they're very hard to break down and score against. I feel they aren't as well-rounded a team to go and win the tournament, but that defensive solidity, especially if they win the group, could see them get to the semifinals at least.
Yeah. I'm with you. I see both of them with the potential to reach the top 4 at least. A lot of it comes down to form. I mean, we probably said that about Ghana going into the 2021 African Cup, and then they finished 4th in the group. So you never really know. But both of them certainly capable of reaching the top 4 or even the final.
Yeah.
How about Cape Verde? Do you think they're going to pass this time?
I think they will. I think they will get out of the group even as a 3rd place finisher. They're going to get a tough draw if that's the case, so they may not go beyond that. But in terms of all the African teams, they're one of my favorite upset teams because I think they do it consistently enough. And again, they're really such a small fish in terms of population size. So they're kind of a team I pull for. And yeah, I think they've kind of pulled surprises with a bit more regularity than some other teams at their level. So yeah, wouldn't be surprised. Kind of hope they have a good tournament again.
I didn't know you liked them so much. Is that why you're wearing their colors?
That's right, a blue shark.
Great. Well, we will be back, possibly with an update podcast if there's enough new information to make that worth the while. Definitely, we'll be back with a look at the Blue Sharks and the Black Stars and the players of each of these teams. That'll probably come out in early December. And meanwhile, we'll be back shortly with Group C.
Sure. Well, I'm glad you didn't nail me down as you normally do to put a prediction on the group.
Oh, I'll be doing that in the future. I just forgot.
All right. Well, if I have to say, I'm going to say pod order, but hoping for a Cape Verde surprise.
Okay, great. We'll see you next time.
Okay, bye.
We originally planned to tag on our past, present, and future plans for the mediacast, but we have instead decided to put a link to that 10-minute video in the show notes. It covers what we're working on and what we plan to do over the next 9 months. We would like to thank Pixabay and Alexei Ivanov of Mappa Music for the wonderful background music accompanying this mediacast.